As gardeners, we are always talking about soil, but today I get to dig a little bit deeper and learn how the geology of a place is just as much part of the ecosystem as the plants.
The real geologists are only interested in what's down there. They see the surface as the soil and vegetation as a nuisance. To me, it's an essential part of the story. It's all interrelated.
Leon Kostemans is a geologist and botanist. He's iconic in plant circles, and if you're interested in Australian plants, you've likely got one of his books on the shelf. He's been studying the relationship between geology and flora for decades. This is where we are.
This is where we are. There's the gate.
And at 91,
And
he's pretty inspiring. To see some of these complex relationships between plant communities and geology in action, we're exploring the Langwarrin Flora and Fauna Reserve, southeast of Melbourne. When you're walking through a place like this, is it just one geology?
No, one of the great things about this reserve is that it's got diversity, and that diversity that you can see in terms of vegetation is actually related to the diversity of what's underneath of the substrate. What's under the surface is just as important as what's above the surface if you want to understand nature, if you want to understand ecosystems. We've got about 4 types of substrate, in other words, soil or rock or whatever. Most of it's sand. And each area is quite different in terms of the vegetation.
To begin to understand sand, it makes sense to start with classic beach sand. About 7 kilometres from here is Seaford Beach on Port Phillip Bay, a stretch of coastal dunes fringed by coastal vegetation.
The coastal sands, which were produced by sea action, are quite young. They're only about 6,000 years old around our bayside. And that beach sand is just quartz sand plus shelly material, no soil. The species that occur on beach sand, they're plants that have coast in front of their names: coast wattle, coast tea tree, coast banksia, and so on. So they're confined just to that strip, or should be confined.
So as you travel inland, how are the sands different here?
The sand here is of quite different origin in the sense that it's wind-blown within the last 100,000 years, something like that, when sea level was lower and there were strong winds. And so they produced much bigger dunes, as you can see here. And it gets sorted in the process because wind can only lift a certain amount of sand. So you don't get coarse sand here, you only get the finest stuff that could build up here. A lot of plants are adapted to that condition. So you get a heathland. You can see there the heath tea tree, the acacia suaveolens, sweet wattle, the brown's wattle over there. You can see hakers. If you go down the slope where the soil is moister, it's nearer the water table, you get a whole lot of other species, but one that you don't get up here, but which you do get down in the valley, is wedding bush, which is spectacular when it's in flower.
And what about other vegetation types on the property? I believe there's a woodland?
Yes, down in the southwestern corner, you've got an area that's down on the Sandringham sandstone, which is a different type of geology again, and it's a grassy woodland, which is mainly silverleaf stringy bark trees and peppermints, but the understory is sedges and grasses. But you also have other species that you don't get on the high areas, such as blackwood wattle.
In a far corner of the reserve, sedimentary rock that sits below everything is much closer to the surface.
There is in the reserve a quarry, a little old quarry, which shows what the rock is like underneath, the basement rock or the bedrock. And that's about 400 million years old, give or take. And it's quite different because it has a veneer of sand, but it's rocky underneath. And you can see it's quite different. It's got different type of vegetation.
We still see narrowleaf peppermint, but when the rock layer is closer to the surface like this, we also start to see swamp gums and messmates. Nearly 40 years ago, Leon co-founded a group of volunteers dedicated to restoring the reserve's plant diversity.
And since then, our role as volunteers has been to work to try and restore it to what we believe should be its natural character.
While the geology underlying these plant communities has been millions of years in the making, human influences have been a lot more sudden, including the clearing of vegetation and the activities of the quarry. These kinds of disturbances give some plants an opportunity to grow where they shouldn't.
When we started here, a lot of the plants here were weeds, as we call them, environmental weeds. There were species that belonged on the coastal sand, but when an area's been disturbed, if it's opened up by fire or clearing, there's a fair chance that the weedy plants will get in. So
because you can grow on the coast, you can grow anywhere.
Yeah.
Right.
That's it.
Despite being native, they're out of place here. When coast wattle and tea tree grow inland, they become dominant and smother out other species.
And so our first job really was to get rid of all the coast tea trees that were around this area, and the heath tea tree, which does belong here, comes back in its place.
Do you feel proud when you look at this area and see what you have achieved in those decades?
I often wish with our volunteers that we could take them back to what it was like, because when you're working and doing just a little bit at a time, you sort of tend to think there's no end to this. But the point is, you've got to really stick at it, because it's just made such a difference, particularly when you see it when it's like this.
You're someone with a good long view of time. I mean, you can look at a 400 million year old rock and think it's, and understand it. What does it feel like to be able to stand here as a human in your 40 years working on this site?
Well, you feel insignificant when you look at it in terms of the time scale. Our human lifetime is just, the tiny bit, thinnest
it's a little bit of leaf litter on
the top of the whole time scale.
As gardeners, we spend a lifetime trying to hone those skills of observation and understanding those complexities of the environment around us. And today, I've had my eyes opened to see those plants that I love so much as a window to what lies beneath. Those ancient forces that are the foundation to every living thing.